Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to all of you who are joining us from Asia. This is the April 12th, 2022 session in our series on entrepreneurship and Asian high-tech industries. For students who are registered for credit, today's the deadline for your comment for the first session of class. If you haven't sent it, please be sure and send it like real soon, tonight. And remember that we could not get approval to make this class by Zoom. So you're expected to be here and you need to sign the attendance sheet while you're here today. Make sure that your attendance is credited. And if you do have a need for some sort of accommodation, if you test positive for COVID, or if you've got a conflict with another class someday, or even more than 1 week, send me a note ahead of time and let's establish an email trail that I've approved the accommodation for that session. So we're very happy today to be able to talk about what's going on in Southeast Asia. And I'm excited to be able to introduce a contact that I made a year ago when we were both on the same program organized by another person, venture capitalist in Taiwan. Today, our speaker is Ms. Rachel Lau, who is the managing partner of RHL Ventures. Rachel has a lot of experience on the investment side. Previously, she was vice president of Hong Kong-based Heitman Investment Management, also in Australia, which was a $4 billion investment entity. And before that, she was an investment analyst with the Dutch firm NN Investment Management, which is a $225 billion investment entity. She's on the board of directors of GNC, the American public company, and she's also president of the Malaysian Gymnastic Federation. She was a rhythmic gymnast when she was in college, I guess, or maybe even around that time. She's been on the leadership team of the Hong Kong nonprofit Elevate. She sits on the program committee of EM Power, which is a nonprofit that is dedicated to improving the situation for at-risk youth in developing countries. In 2018, she was named one of 50 people redefining the way we live by Business Times of Singapore. She's a Millikan Institute Young Leader, and she has a Bachelor's of Commerce degree from Australia National University and then a Master of Law from University of Sydney. So Rachel, tell us your story from your side. How do you tie all these things together?
Good morning and good afternoon to everyone who's joining in. Thank you, Richard, for inviting me to the session. Welcome, everybody, and I hope this is useful for everyone as well. The question was, how do I tie everything together? I started as a gymnast as a kid, but then that was more, more leisure or amateur when I was a kid. So don't worry about that part. The association or the federation was more a hobby than anything else, more as trying to give back to society and trying to see whether we could elevate the sport in Malaysia. But as a whole, I run RHL Ventures, which is one of the largest VCs in Malaysia. We invest in Southeast Asian companies or startups, mostly Series A, B, but we've also gone into other stuff such as venture debt recently. We work very closely with sovereign funds or high net worth investors plus institutional investors, more because these segments of investors understand the need for innovation, has a little bit longer time horizon in terms of their investment styles. And so we've been in this business since 2016, 2017. I moved back from Hong Kong, being a public equities analyst to Malaysia in 2017. And therefore, really started institutionalizing the business in this part of the world. VC or or venture capital in this part of the world is pretty nascent, unlike the US, which has seen investments in tech or innovations for a really long time.
You really moved into this around 2016 or 2017?
So yes. I moved to Southeast Asia 2016, 2017. Well, 2017, really. Yep.
So you've seen just an amazing amount of change since then.
Yes. When we came back, there was almost nobody investing in, especially in Malaysia. I'd say we've been doing this in the last 5 years or so, and we've seen a huge change, especially accelerated by COVID.
Okay. What do you think has been the driving factors in this incredible increase?
I think COVID obviously has helped. Unlike the West, or unlike the Western economies, the South Asian economies are very, a lot of it are day earners, right? When COVID hit, there was a lot of issues getting to work. A lot of SMEs who couldn't sell to their customers, who couldn't perform their tasks on a daily basis. I think there was a huge need for digitalization. I think we understand it now. So people, in this part of the world, WhatsApp's a really big thing. So people understand it has moved to, Facebook and WhatsApp and Instagram to sell their products, going on to Lazada or Shopee. Amazon's not big here. And so, there's been different channels of sales, and people understanding the different channels of sales. So it took a little while for people to get there, but we're there now, right? We've also had a couple of successful or unsuccessful IPO, however you treat it to be. You're successful if you're a Series A investor. If you're probably not so successful if you're the last investor going in. So there's been a couple of big high-profile IPOs, which obviously then tallies back with the fact that this is a part of the world that's getting ripe for investments. People understand the region a little bit better. There's 14 unicorns in Southeast Asia right now. We expect to see a lot more coming in this year or next year. So things are heating up, and I think that's why once things are heating up, people are coming in a little bit more.
Yeah, so I want to go into more about just understanding the landscape in Southeast Asia. But before that, I came right in the middle of your own story, and I'd really like for you to be able to talk about how you grew up and did you grow up in Australia, or did you grow up in Malaysia, or where did you grow up?
So I was here for high school and elementary school. Then in college, I did college in Australia, did finance and law. Typical good Asian kid, you do what your parents tell you to do. Didn't think very much about it. Got a job in Hong Kong, did buy-side equities, and then got sent over to the US, traded emerging market debt for ING in Atlanta. Atlanta ING bought over Georgia Life, which was the largest life insurance in part of the world. And so they were heavily skewed towards debt and wanted exposure to emerging market debt. Then moved over to New York to do multi-assets. Again, understanding, putting options overlay on some of the trading strategies that, we could use to protect our investments. Got a bit bored of New York, went back to Hong Kong because I wanted the action. So it was a good time in the sense that I think it was 2013 or so. There was a series of there was a couple of high or big series of IPOs that was happening in the region. So got into those in terms of investing. So invested for Heitman at a time. They're actually Chicago based. I was employee number 1 for Hong Kong for them. And then we traded the Asian book for those guys. And then decided that as fees were being compressed on the public market side, I wanted to go to private markets. It made a little bit more sense to go into Southeast Asia as opposed to the rest of the world, because it was a growing region. I was familiar with the markets. I was investing in it privately as a angel investor with some friends to pull over some capital, and we started this thing called RHL Ventures. But along the way, you see a lot of opportunities, which was quite interesting. So my family's in healthcare, so we ended up dabbling in some of the pharmaceutical stuff. So GNC is the board that I serve, which fortunate or unfortunate during COVID time, we filed for Chapter 11 and hence privatized it with some Chinese money. But again, streamlining some of the processes, moving some of the operations globally as opposed to being focused in the US. Then here I'm on the board of pharmacies, which is also another pharmaceutical chain. And again, because the background is in healthcare and investing, kind of investing a little bit more time into healthcare and technology, which is the two things that I think is a game changer in this part of the world. And so I'm here mostly doing deployment right now. We've raised a couple of funds during COVID time. Again, I think we kind of did it counter-cyclical in a sense that we thought that as everybody was sitting in their homes, everybody could only watch YouTube or be on Facebook and Instagram. And so we decided that, we should deploy much quicker, much faster during COVID time. So we started, and I think, so I was in Hong Kong during SARS. And I think if you're in Hong Kong during SARS and H1N1 during in Hong Kong, you kind of understand the psyche of an influenza. In this part of the world, we haven't seen it that badly, but in somewhere like Hong Kong, where it was badly affected, it was, you could see that you could understand the fear of the influenza, right? So we ended up thinking or having the counter-cyclical view that, I think this thing was much larger than we thought. And so therefore we were going to be at home much longer than we thought as well. And so at the converse, we ended up investing a lot more than we should have and put in multiple funds quicker than we thought we would. I think also because everybody was bored and not doing anything else, we got lucky. So we were the only guys in town that were
nothing to do but invest. Huh? Okay.
Yeah, no. I think everybody was aggressive, right? Because everyone's bored. I mean, if you look at inflation, we talk about the great resignations and everything else, but I think that it's also a push up of there's more liquidity than ever. I started my career in 08, 09, and I understand liquidity because when I first went into the firm, someone told me, there's a race to the bottom for rates. And also this is one way up inflation. So I didn't really understand this, right? And so my boss at the time told me a couple of, like charts in a sense that, every time there's devaluation of currency, asset prices goes up. And so, we took the counter view of, I think asset prices will be moved up pretty quickly once everything normalizes. Of course, I didn't expect COVID to be 2 years and we're all going to be at home for 2 years. We thought it was kind of a 6 months thing. And so we were very aggressive in the first 6 months or that first 1 year. And then last year, we managed to raise new funds because we were aggressive in 2020 when everybody else wasn't. And so I think that was one of those things that, we kind of capitalized on the fact that, nobody was doing anything. And I think, it was a good time for us.
Yeah, okay. So there's so much in what you just introduced, right? Not only your own kind of story of how you got involved in investing and what sort of investing, attitudes you have, and also what you see as hot now. We've got a number of, we're starting to get questions. And
Sure.
What I'd like to do is invite people who are joining by Zoom to write your questions in chat. We will get to them, but we might get to them in a slightly different order than you asked. So Malaysia has a long history for being part of the Asia supply chain in hardware.
Yes.
There was a lot of, computer chip packaging that was done in Malaysia. There was a lot of wire bonding, that kind of thing. How has the sort of high-tech side of Malaysia changed over the years?
Well, I think Malaysia has been really slow in terms of adopting technology. So we've always been, the global supply chain for hardware. So, you're right. So your Western Digital, your Seagate, everybody has big factories here. This is before, Thailand gave them a 20-year incentive with zero taxes. But basically in Malaysia, if you were producing hardware here, you had zero taxes, by the way, for 25 years or so. Which again changes the economics on manufacturing quite a bit. But essentially, I think we've kind of just, we've been We haven't done anything actually, to be fair. We've just kind of set and, kind of reap the benefits of
It's a stable business where you're a supplier
Correct.
to somebody else. Yeah.
Yes. So I think we've got great hardware engineers. I think in terms of software engineers, we're a bit lacking. So if you look at where innovation has been, it really has happened in Indonesia and Vietnam. Places where there are a bit more pain points as opposed to Malaysia.
Now, hold on. Just saying, when you say where innovation has happened,
yes,
is Indonesia and Vietnam. What are the kind of things? Are you talking about consumer businesses, or are you also talking about B2B?
I think a bit both. I think innovation in the consumer business obviously has happened more in Indonesia and Vietnam, but I'd say even adaptability of corporates, willingness to invest, it's definitely Indonesia. So it leads the pack. I'd say out of like the top 20 families in Indonesia, I said everybody's invested in tech already. I'd say top 20 families or top 50 families in Malaysia, I'd say like 5 has invested in tech, right? I think it's a really comfortable place in Malaysia. And one of the things that, I tell a lot of people when they come over and they realize how cheap everything is there's no real reason to innovate if you're comfortable. Malaysia is a really comfortable place in a sense that a lot of things are subsidized because we produce oil, right? And so when you're digging money from the ground, everything can be heavily subsidized in a lot of parts of the world that we know. And so therefore, a lot of things are kept really low in terms of prices. Again, therefore, you live a very comfortable life in Malaysia. And so if you are innovation, the likelihood of you going above and beyond in terms of disrupting the markets is probably not as likely as someone in Indonesia where there's a lot of pain points to solve, right? And so therefore, if we're talking about real investments and innovations, I think, it's really happened in Indonesia as opposed to anywhere else.
It's interesting that level of comfort may be a negative factor in how many people really choose to go into entrepreneurship or choose to try to change things, right?
Yes. So I lived in Hong Kong for a lot of years. And again, you would think that because of technology and the high skill that the Honkies had, there would be more investments, more tech in Hong Kong. And I said, it's actually quite the converse, right? For grocery deliveries, for example, you don't really need to because there's a supermarket everywhere in Hong Kong. Like where I live, the condo I live, there's 5 supermarkets in a vicinity of 2 yards. And I think people understand this. And so, it becomes really expensive to do any fulfillment, for example. Cost of labor is expensive. And so therefore, somewhere like Indonesia as well, you could also take a lot of chances. The consumer base is a lot bigger as well. So, places like India, China, the US, where the consumer base is big, you're able to take a little bit more chances because your adaptability also probably is a bit higher than the rest of the world.
Yeah, okay. So with this kind of a stable industrial base that a lot of people want to get into, prestigious jobs or, prestigious companies to work for, I'm curious, a couple of questions from the audience on Zoom. One is about the LP base for venture investment in Malaysia and also more broadly in Southeast Asia. You had mentioned a number of families in Indonesia. Who are the LPs? Is it a big base of domestic money or is it a lot of foreign money coming in?
So I've seen some of the questions coming in. So, okay, so there is no big Malaysian LP base. There's huge Malaysian investors from a sovereign funds perspective. So you think about CalPERS or teachers pensions funds equivalent in Malaysia. They're all here. And so they write really big checks. But the risk appetite is pretty low towards venture or private equity to begin with. So I think we're starting to move allocations from public markets or real estate into private equity at this point. So I think Bain or McKinsey wrote a paper and say, hey, we'll suggest 4% into private equity, right? Out of the 4% for private equity, I'd say there's almost none to venture. And so, in terms of LP base, we don't have much on the Malaysian side. But what we ended up, having was a government led initiative last year to invest in venture funds. in a sense that, we saw this happening in Singapore in 2013 or so. And so they started a funds on funds model to invest in venture capital emerging managers. And therefore, something was replicated in Malaysia to do exactly that. But the difference was, every are going to put in its match rate capital. We managed to get outside capital. When I say outside, I mean out of Southeast Asia. So a lot of the money was actually North Asian investors to come in, and therefore then
hold on,
Malaysian.
Rachel, sometimes your sound is a little bit garbled. Speak a bit slower. Did you say South Asia investors?
No, North Asian investors. So we had a lot of Korean LPs coming in.
Investors. Okay.
Yeah. So our largest anchors are actually Korean government. So through an entity called KVIC. So those guys are probably our largest anchors outside of Malaysia. And the other anchor obviously is the government subsidiary of the Ministry of Finance, with the view of spurring innovations in Malaysia.
So these government funds, how are they related to organizations like MDEC, Malaysia Digital Economy Consortium, or I think that was the term for them, because they're essentially government sponsored.
So for the Malaysian entity, yes, they're government sponsored. For the Korean money, I don't think they're okay. So KVIC is probably.
I think the Korean money is private sector.
Yes, and KVIC comes from multiple, government and individual LPs, which are the banks and everything else. In Malaysia, yes. So that's Ministry of Finance money, correct.
So are you seeing some of the big traditional industries like banks and so forth getting involved in these sort of alternative investments?
I'd say if there's a clock, we're at 2 o'clock. I think they're starting to look at it. I doubt I doubt any of the banks actually have put in any checks. And if they have, they're mostly Singaporean banks, who's a little bit, ahead of everybody else in terms of investing. But other than that, I'm not 100% sure who else is investing.
Okay. So getting the kind of Southeast Asia landscape more or less, in order. The position of Malaysia was comfortable because there was a lot of supply chain business early on. You have these massive changes in consumer behavior in places like Indonesia and Vietnam. You've got Singapore that's working as kind of a good financial nexus where you can kind of watch everything going on everywhere. How do you get across these borders? Because basically it's really easy to think that it's not a challenge to work in multiple countries, and yet there's a lot of different regulations and different kind of things you have to deal with. How do you manage that and look Southeast Asia wide?
So I think the biggest fallacy is that Southeast Asia is one country. We don't have a common currency. We don't have common laws. We don't have common languages. Some of them are the civil code, some of them are the common laws, right? So I think the legal and judiciary system is very different from a country to country perspective. Culture is a bit different. I think the only thing we've got in common is actually the age group, which is a pretty young age group across the board. So I think on average, it's between 26 to 32 years old. Singapore, Malaysia is probably at the higher end, and somewhere like Indonesia and Vietnam's a bit at the lower end. So you've got a very young population of people moving into or emerging into the middle class, and that's probably the commonality that you have. I think at that age, a lot of people are tech savvy. Everybody is also mobile first at that age group, given that hardware is a little bit more expensive, so it's cheaper to get a cell phone versus a laptop, right? And so if you're mobile first, the ability to do things on mobile is a lot cheaper than hardware again. So I think we've kind of invested in things that could be translated across the regional side. So to be fair, we have invested
So
mostly. Yep.
before we get off this about mobile phones, are they relatively easy to carry all across Southeast Asia? What's the kind of situation with, international charges and that sort of situation? Most people, I guess, are using smartphones now.
Yes. So I have data. So I pay 80 ringgit, just $20 for my monthly cell phone charges. And I get to travel in Southeast Asia with data for free, up to 10 gigabytes, which is actually more than sufficient. And so I don't have to pay extra, right? And so you usually get a deal like that, and it's not too much money anyway. And so again, so if you're able to move around, it's quite easy. The other thing is something like Grab. I use Grab in Malaysia, Singapore, Vietnam, Thailand, and it's the same app. You don't have to change anything else. It gets, you go in, you type your destination, it gets charged to your card, and that's it. It's pretty simple.
So one of the differences between the different Southeast Asian countries is basic income level. So
Yes.
Malaysia was quite high.
Yes.
But, right next door in Vietnam, it's considerably lower, and a lot lower than that in Cambodia and so forth. Are you seeing a lot of government subsidy that's enabling people to leapfrog new kind of approaches to technology?
Well, yes and no. So I'll give you an example of Myanmar. So I went to Myanmar 4 years ago. And again, quite interestingly, in Myanmar, they were giving out, 2G phones, right? So I knew the telco owners. I said, what do you think about digital technology? And they said it was really funny. So when they first brought telecoms or 4G or 3G, but more 3G actually, into the markets, they thought people wanted just a basic cell phone, and they kind of just get, the old Nokia 8825 and kind of said, hey, we'll give you the old phones that was recycled. And so it was $200 for a phone and a SIM card. They quickly realized that people were throwing out the phones and getting new phones themselves and putting in the SIM cards to the new phones, and obviously tapping data more than the cell phone. The normal phone users. So then we realized that people have started adapting to that much quicker than we thought it would be. So I don't think it's government subsidized, in a sense that I think infrastructure has never been well planned in this part of the world. So therefore, there's little subsidies from that point of view. But I think, because of the younger population, people are just hungry for knowledge. People, it's accessibility. So I think people are willing to pay a little bit more for that accessibility versus, somewhere like in the US, where you don't really need to pay up, a large portion of your daily expenses for data, for example. So I don't think so much government subsidies, but and again, places like Vietnam and Indonesia, there hasn't been much government subsidies. There's just been a lot of funds being set up in that part of the world because of the population promise. So I think it's more private sector led than government in this part of the world.
Yeah, I remember that at least for a while, Vietnam was famous for internet cafes, that was how most people were accessing. Are you getting a lot of prepaid minutes where people are using data really from prepaid minutes, or is it pretty much subscription like it is in other areas?
I don't have the stats for it, and I can't tell you for sure. But I think things are changing, and people are having more fixed subscriptions right now. But I'm not 100% sure on that.
Okay, so you're active in investing all across Southeast Asia. How important is it for you to have a local partner, either a co-investor or somebody in each location you're investing in? Or can you pretty much work without having a special local partner?
We do work with local partners, and we do work with everybody a lot. I think in Southeast Asia, because we're quite early into investing in this part of the world, everybody's pretty collaborative. So there's no real reason to fight a competition.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Things are heating up. So, things are changing, but I think it's probably more this year than, previous years. So people are a little bit more protective of their deals and people are starting to hoard deals. I say it's also because, we've been raising record amounts of money, and there's also more foreign investors coming in. In the final parts of the world have started coming in, which traditionally was never here. So we've seen a lot more foreign investors coming in. And so therefore, writing larger checks than, we're normally accustomed to. So I think now it's starting to heat up, but for
So
now,
heat
we're
up
still
in
okay.
terms of, are the valuations getting a little bit on the
Yes,
too positive side?
a bit too positive, right? So I'll give you an example. So every Y Combinator company is now at $25 to $30 million cap from the first round on a safe note. Used to be 15 to 20. So I think after this demo day, which was last week, everything's 25 to 30 million. I think there was 400 companies that went into the program. A lot of it was emerging markets. So, LATAM, Africa, and Southeast Asia. And so at this part of the world, for seed investments, I'd say like 5 years ago when I started, seed was valuation was about $5 million US, and then became 10, and then probably 15. And now with Y Combinator coming in, people are starting at 25, 30, right? So I'm not 100% sure whether the markets are able to support that valuation. So we'll probably get a lot of crash and burns, to be honest.
So that one institution has had an impact on the kind of general situation across the region.
Yep. So I think, yes, so I think they started, I know the first batch of Southeast Asia started 2017. And I think at that point it was doing some valuations, but at this point, I think the safe notes are 25, 30. So like on aggregate, we see everybody starting with 25, 30, which again, it's quite a bit of a shocker to us. We saw that last year. We kind of thought it was a bit expensive, and to be fair, we kind of passed on a lot of deals. But this year we see everybody consistently coming up at 25, $30 million on the first round, which again, that's typically a second or third round raise.
So we have a couple of questions about exits. First of all, would you say that, the pattern in the US is really 9 exits by M&A for every exit by IPO, but in North Asia, in Japan and in South Korea, you really have more IPOs than you have M&A exits. What's the situation like where you are?
I think in this part of the world, probably the same. We've seen M&As heating up during the COVID time. I think it was, twofold, right? One, liquidity was pretty dry, and so therefore people had to sell. But two, the larger players was also coming in, and it was a big entrance into the market. I use Faye, for example. It's a Malaysian company that got sold to an Indian company. And so basically we've seen that happening a little bit more. They wanted entry into the market, and therefore they bought out Faye. We've seen a couple more smaller Series A, B companies getting bought out pretty quickly. I'd say, maybe 5 years ago, it was mostly IPOs. So we're ramping up for 2 IPOs this year as well, or this year, next year, depending on what markets lie. But, now we're also considering a trade sale. So we had, once, again, it's quite funny, right? So once you put out the word that you're going to IPO, people say, hey, instead of you doing an IPO, why don't I conclude your pain a lot quicker and I take it off the markets for you? So we're also getting offers for the particular company from, a competitor. So we're seeing a range of exit strategies right now.
Okay. For the IPOs, where are people choosing to IPO?
We're going to try one in the Malaysian markets, which is honestly quite tricky. There's a lot of requirements for Malaysian IPOs in a sense that, there's a number of years of revenues and profitabilities that you need to hit. You've got to have like a blue chip sponsor in a sense that, you need a big investment bank to put, your deck together and is willing to sponsor you for the next 3 to 5 years. So these are all part of the listing requirements. We're also having another one in Australia, and that's a little bit easier. And I think that one, the broker and the sponsor is probably the same guy, unless they muck it up. But so far the pre-IPO round has been concluded, and they've done a pretty good job. And so we're probably going to stick with these guys and launch it probably August, September.
Yeah, okay. So I got a couple of questions about sort of sectors. First of all,
Sure.
let me ask you about the super apps. Right?
Yep.
So things that started out as ride hailing like Gojek or Grab or whatever, have really turned into sort of an almost an ant group model that you have in China.
Yep. Yep.
What's going to happen to them? Are they going to be busted up? Do you think that the ones in Southeast Asia will continue to be dominant?
I'm not 100% sure, right? I think somewhere in China makes sense because it's one platform. So a lot of things make sense to be on WeChat. And so therefore a super app kind of makes sense. I'm in two minds of a super app. That's not a very popular thing to say. But I find a lot of these apps really unnecessary is probably a better way to put it. And this is a super app, right? You use it, right? But would I use everything on Grab? Probably not. The reality of it is if you have Grab, you're pretty good in terms of traveling. And so if you're in Vietnam or Thailand, you probably just live with Grab. And if you're, unless you're if you're in Indonesia, then you'll have Goto, and they had a successful IPO. But other than that, to be honest, I don't probably use it as much as what people would think. I think the other problem that I think the apps are probably facing is the stickiness of users. So something like WeChat makes sense because your WeChat's your Facebook, your Instagram, your PayPal, your it's a one stop of everything, right? So the super app kind of makes sense in China. In Southeast Asia, because we've got so many apps, unless you're telling me Facebook buying and aggregating everything else, there's really no reason for a super app. And again, this is a very unpopular thing to say, but there's probably not that useful. Like I'm not going to buy insurance in Grab. Well, you can say whatever you want to say. I'm not probably going to bank with Grab. You can say whatever you want to say.
Okay.
And so from that standpoint, I don't see it necessary.
So as we continue to talk about sectors or particular business types, how do you see education, especially online education? So Asia has always been really supportive of educational opportunities for their children. Are you seeing a lot happening in Southeast Asia in this sector?
Yes. I think the answer is yes, but I don't think we've gotten a great solution. We need more innovation. So Southeast Asia has been pretty bad in terms of like handling COVID in a sense of education. I think public health safety, we've done a great job, right? So our vaccination rates were probably one of the highest in the world, much quicker than a lot of people.
Wow.
One, because we needed it. So like I was double boosted in October. I was vaccinated by May. So if you think about it, I think we were pretty diligent from that standpoint. But the problem was the kids weren't vaccinated, and when the kids weren't vaccinated, there was, they couldn't go to school. We didn't have very good online teaching. So the private schools, and again, like in somewhere like Malaysia, there was huge divergence of like kids' education. So the private schools were pretty good in terms of setup, and they were very quick at reacting. So very quickly they understood that this was going to go on for much longer, and so we've got to have like online teaching. And there was also accessibility to teachers. The public schools, for example, when the ratio is 1:40 versus 1:20, they didn't have that luxury. And so therefore, I'd say if you went to a public school, you're probably significantly behind. In Malaysia, we started trialing things like putting education on TV, which was rubbish because they thought really rubbish syllabus. And so we ended up investing in education apps. We went into something called Pandai, which is, it's the Bahasa translation for intelligent. But again, when you talk to these guys, so Harvard invested in it with us. And so it was quite interesting in the way that they kind of put their syllabus together. It was the local syllabus, either local or GCSE syllabus, which a lot of the kids use these days. And then also testing these kids. And so while you were teaching it, we were also testing the kids because we also have to make sure that the kids could take an exam if they needed to take exams. So while you were really good at understanding a subject matter, you should also be able to take an exam, successfully. And I think that's the measure of, how smart you are in this part of the world, which is a bit sad. But essentially, we invested in something like that. But again, for us, by testing some of these kids through the test scorings, we also understand what they were lacking in terms of their understanding. And so we ended up, being able to drill into the subject matters that they needed more help and putting more guidance into that. And so, we've kind of, invested in quite a bit. And so, yes, the answer in short is we are investing more in education. Education has been a focal point in Southeast Asia, but there hasn't been a great solution across the board.
So, the situation as it is, if people going to public schools are getting left behind, are you seeing a stretch, higher Gini coefficients, or anything that kind of a digital divide is a concern?
Yes, so digital divide is a big deal. The wealth gap is getting bigger, but I think that's probably across the world as opposed to just Malaysia or Southeast Asia specifically. We do see a lot of issues coming out. There's a lot of social unrest in this part of the world because of that. I include, places like China. I think the wealth gap's real. And again, the digital divide is also very real. And so people have been left behind.
So kind of as I think back to the investment side of this, are most of the countries that, most of the companies that are in portfolios, are they mostly going to stay domestic, or are they going to try to go like grab throughout the region?
Well, if you're a domestic company, unless you're Indonesia based, which is like Gotoh,
right, which is huge. Yeah.
You have to be, and there's no other ways of it. We've seen some Filipino companies being quite successful in disrupting the fintech space. So they haven't gone overseas, but someone like Gotoh did, right? They tried and they weren't successful. So, Gojek tried, they weren't successful, and they ended up merging with Tokopedia in a sense that needed it to be bigger. So we've seen quite a few guys going regional, some successful, some not successful. So Carson, for example, is a Malaysian unicorn, and they've been pretty successful in Indonesia. But I say, there's probably, the unicorn versus the nons. And so again, like you have to be regional if you want to be,
if you want to have a big enough market to really grow. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So it's interesting that, Gojek that came out of Indonesia came out of a really big domestic market, and maybe that distracted them a little bit in terms of keeping them from expanding regionally more earlier.
Well, yes and no, because I mean, you've rightly pointed out the consumers, the wealth of the income level is not that high, right? So how do you justify the valuations of 10, 20, 30 billion dollars when people aren't able to spend that much money? And so you're saying that you're going to capture a huge percentage of the population plus a significant portion of their wallet share, right? Which again is not happening. Like guys like myself, we're not using it, not to the same extent that the investors thought we were going to be using it. Okay. And so therefore you had to do regional because you had no story to sell. You're not going to be able to justify your next round valuation. And so they've realized on a regional level, it was not a successful option. And so therefore, went back to the domestic markets where they were strong at and kind of merging with Tokopedia, which is a consumer play. And again, for Tokopedia, there was no real reason to come out of Indonesia, because if you did, you're going to get killed by Shopee and Lazada, who were two public listed companies with huge war chests. As an e-commerce play, you didn't have much of an edge, and I think they realized that they had to be a domestic play, and so therefore the merger last year, and therefore the IPO last week, yesterday or the day before. Yep.
Okay, moving on sector to sector, are ESG related opportunities starting to attract attention among entrepreneurs now, or do you see big opportunities for ESG related businesses in Southeast Asia?
So I think for us, we've always been quite cognizant about ESG, and we've kind of invested more into ESG related companies, but more in a sense, not so much to kind of fulfill the UN SDG goals, for example, but more, the way we had a philosophy that if you do well, if you do good, you will do well, right? In a sense that we wanted to just kind of invest in guys that did well, and that was did good, and that was basically it. Then we realized people who cared a little bit more about the environment, who cared a little bit more about stakeholder management or stakeholder feedback, did a little bit better. And again, diversity was obviously something that we cared about quite a bit. I always get pointed to boards because I'm a double minority or a triple minority at that point, young female Asian. Now maybe not so much the young, but then the female Asian kind of stands, right? And so diversity was something that we kind of looked at quite a bit. We didn't think there was a huge diversity. We published a report maybe 3 years ago, which was extremely unpopular as well, which was 65% of the board of directors in Malaysia came from one school and was male.
I'm sorry.
And
what percentage?
65. 65.
65.
65.
Wow.
65.
65.
65 from one. So it's quite interesting from that standpoint. And I think the guys, and I think you kind of gravitate towards people like you, right? And so the guys that were on the boards were looking for guys who went to the same school as them, because basically that was how they formed friendship over the years, and there was a huge trust factor. So again, ironically, we saw that we published a report, which again was not very this is the top 100 companies in Malaysia. Again, that was not a very popular research that we published, but it is what it is, and I don't think we've seen a huge change yet. I've gotten some calls, but I think it was more to fulfill a quota, which then I kind of rejected, versus an actual want or need to change. So ESG, but also more from the standpoint of environmental and diversity, and again human capital. In our business, it's human capital, and the entrepreneur is all about the entrepreneurs. What they need, how are they going to react to a situation, especially to black swan events like COVID. We saw the good guys and the bad guys pretty quickly, in a sense that we saw a lot of guys who understood how to pivot and how to move quickly, but we also saw guys who just was stumped at COVID and kind of just sat there and kind of started wailing. And so we kind of saw that divergence of resilience that came out from COVID. And so it's been interesting.
So you keep saying guys. Are
Yes.
many of the entrepreneurs women?
No, I want to say, if I had to guess, and I don't have the stats with me, I want to say 80% of the entrepreneurs are men, and probably 20% are female, if there's 20. On average, I don't see that many women entrepreneurs. I'm not 100%.
Also reflected on the investor side?
Yes. So my entire group, we've got 15, and there's one female. It's not that we don't try. We try really hard to get females coming in, but people aren't interested in the long hours. People aren't interested in either they don't have the technical skills, or they're not interested in the long hours, or they're just not simply interested in it, right? Which again is quite puzzling for me. And somewhere in Hong Kong and New York, I didn't have a problem, having a lot of female colleagues. In Malaysia, in Southeast Asia, I don't see that many females. So yes.
So you mentioned that you're a double minority, meaning ethnically Chinese, right?
Yeah.
And grew up and living in Malaysia and so forth, as well as being a woman. Are you finding, and you're saying that this is making you really busy?
Yes.
How do you see that developing? Are there programs to try to bring more young women into the scene?
Well, I think we've got a lot of young women in the scene. We just don't have a lot of senior people in the scene. And I think that's probably the issue. I was with an aunt who is, she chairs the Women's Institute of Management. I think that's the right name for it. And she said, hey, we've got every time we were looking for a woman director, we can't find one. And I said, why? And then she says, because they don't have the experience in this. And then my counter argument is, if you don't have someone who's experienced in this, why don't you get someone who doesn't have the experience in this and let her build up the experience to what you need it to be, right? So I don't think people are giving women enough of a chance to do that. There's a lot of check boxes that people like here, and a lot of times people don't get to take that check boxes, and so therefore it's a lot easier to hire men. And again, there's nothing wrong with it, but and I don't really believe in quotas. But I think the diversity helps. It's a different viewpoint. Sure. There was a corporate governance call I was on with some of the directors. This is all the public directors in Malaysia. And there was this old chap, and he said, hey, we hired, 2 young punks on the board, and it was great. They get so much, such differentiated feedback. And when we started out, we were really afraid to use these 2 guys. And then I asked, how old are they? And they said 42. So, and he was 70 years old, thinking that the 2-year-old guys were young punks. And so I think it's just not women, right? I think also the diversity of age is pretty important, especially if you want to do digital and innovation. So I hire a bunch of young 21-year-olds. And so every month I ask them for what's the coolest and the hippest fad, because everything is changing very quickly. And, I don't think I've kept up with the rest of the world. And so I think not just on a gender basis, right? On an age basis, I don't think we've kept up with,
Okay. One thing I want to remind everybody of here is that basically Malaysia and also Indonesia are Muslim countries.
Yes.
Number of people in the Islamic faith is quite high. Do you see that as kind of more of an opportunity area, or are there restrictions on what you can do?
A bit of both. So our mandate, because it's supported by the Ministry of Finance, you're not allowed to go into sin items. Sin items include alcohol. And also include interest-bearing entities. So for example, a bank is a sin-bearing because it's not Sharia compliant. But there are guys around that. I'm not 100% sure how to explain this, but you work around interest-bearing assets to give profit sharing instruments. So there's other ways around it. But yes and no. I think the Muslim economy is a big economy that we're looking at, with especially the opening up of the Middle East. But I have to say that we're not. I think for us, we're still very early in investing in Southeast Asia. So I don't think we kind of zoom in and say we're going to do only Islamic financing or Islamic or Muslim opportunities. I think an opportunity presents itself, we'll invest regardless, and then we kind of just access the startups on its own merits.
So I do know that there are special financing tools that are used in, Sharia compliant communities. And if you're on the outside and want to cooperate with somebody in one of these, is there a good way to find out more about how they work?
I'm sure that people be able to direct you here. I'm not well versed in this, so I won't admit to be an expert in it. But there's probably a couple of guys that I could direct you to. Okay.
So in that regard, that says that it's not an essential part of really developing the Southeast Asia strategy.
No.
What's happening with blockchain in Southeast Asia?
Blockchain has been getting quite a bit of attention probably in the last couple of months or so, but I don't think there's been huge adoptability here, in the sense that where people talk about blockchain and you kind of have things to disrupt. We're disrupting basic things, food, transportations. I don't think it's so much access to access to alternative financing. I think we just need access to financing as a whole. So if you think about it,
financing period. Okay.
Period, right? So I said the majority of the population in Southeast Asia is unbanked at this point. And so let's not talk about crypto wallets. Let's just talk about e-wallets, which is basically getting people to pay digitally, right? And so we're not. I mean, there's a selective group of people who trade blockchain, but otherwise, I don't think we're anywhere close to there yet.
Okay, hold for just a second. We've got a question from one of our students.
So going off of that, when we look at the population in Malaysia, where are those who are investing making those investments? And I'm talking in terms of like the public market. So are they investing on like public markets in Malaysia, or are they investing in Singapore? Like not necessarily those top 100 families, but also not the ones that don't have a bank account, like that middle ground. Where are they?
So you're kind of talking about the almost mythical individual investor.
Yeah, I guess what is the
Okay, so for normal people who are not, card carrying venture capitalists, and also they're not the giant families that have a lot of wealth, are they investing in public markets? What are they doing with their funds?
I think most of the guys, and I think that's basically coming back to access to financing. We're investing in a fintech app right now, just basically to do that. I'd say as a whole, majority of the population are not invested by and large. So we're they start with cash management or it's called fixed deposits here. So you put in your money for X amount of time, you get an interest bearing facility on that. And then maybe is public markets from Malaysia standpoint. An example, for example, for international markets. So if you invest in the US markets through a Malaysian share trading account, it's $25. I can do it $1 on Interactive Brokers. So the access to capital markets is not there either in Malaysia or, the things I talk about is excluding Singapore, right? So this is probably consistent across Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand or so. I don't think we've got good investments or savings plan for this part of the world yet. And so in short, yes, most of the people put money into their pension funds. It's 9% mandatory contribution by the employer and contribution by the employee. So it's pretty high from that standpoint.
Mandatory, okay.
Yes, but other than that, from an investment standpoint, actually, to be fair, most people are not that savvy, and therefore, we're investing in very rudimentary stuff.
So hold on. If that's a mandatory kind of retirement contribution, is it managed by private sector financial institutions like banks or pension funds?
It's managed by pension funds. So there's a couple of big pension funds in Malaysia and Southeast Asia. And so these guys probably dominate the markets. And so, the guys that I was talking to you about in terms of investing in public markets or real estate investments, things bricks and mortars, which they really understand. Those are the guys or the large sovereign funds are the guys that are usually invested in that.
Do they play a big part in the LP world in venture investing, or are they can't do it because it's too risky?
Well, they've got no clue what's going on.
Okay. No, because, mutual funds are, sought after for LPs here, right?
Yes. We're really early, right? So another example that I would give is, the management. So to buy a mutual fund in Malaysia, the management fees is 5%. It's probably nothing in the US anyway. You can buy this. You can buy an ETF for 25 basis points. So that's 20 times spread in terms of what you can get in terms of access. And so when people talk about, are you investing in guys that are going to, the moon? We say no, because, we've got to solve the basic stuff first. And these are what we would consider the basic, right? Access to financing.
Okay. We do have another question from the room, but I want to get this one off of chat first. So this is kind of more like focus of investing, not just particular sector, but does government policy about improving education or financial inclusivity and that sort of stuff, does that really help point the way to investors, or is it basically noise?
Well, okay, so government policies are very populist in this part of the world. It's about winning votes. but I would probably say that is consistent across the world. I'd say everybody has good intentions, but that doesn't necessarily mean execution has been perfect or even there. And I say this, with a heavy heart, in the sense that education is obviously a big thing in my mind. So I sit on a school board, Charterhouse. It's a UK school, one of the largest private schools in the UK coming into Malaysia. And you see the discrepancy between a private school and a public school, in a sense that, the facilities that was given or you have access to versus the facilities that, public school has. And I think policies haven't been great in terms of supporting the evolution of education. We're pretty far behind in understanding what is needed in today's day and society. For example,
So
technology.
Rachel, in your deal flow, are you paying attention
Mhm.
to the government policies much, or just that's kind of, you don't have to consider it?
I think it's an afterthought as opposed to anything else.
Okay.
We're not China. China, it probably affects you quite a bit. In this part of the world, they're constantly keeping up with us versus the other way around. So a lot of it is more reactive than proactive. Blockchain is reactive, for example. VC is reactive in the sense that, we took 10 years to kind of come up with a funds on funds system to spur innovation. There's a lot of events. I don't find events useful. I find actual execution that matters. We've also had, pretty unstable political system in the last couple of years, not just in Malaysia. I mean, globally, I think we've seen the same thing, right? And because of that, because of the government changes, we haven't seen consistency in policies as well, or continuity in some of the policies that's happened.
Okay, thank you. Question from the room. You've been patient. Go ahead.
So thanks for Rachel. We're talking about financial sectors. As Rachel mentioned, there's a huge gap between the unbanked person versus the e-payment solution. A couple of years ago, when I was with unfinanced Alibaba, I know I was in the team who tried to expand the solution to Southeast Asia. Lazada is one of the solutions, the joint venture between the Alipay and the local government there. But I heard that they run into a huge competition and resistance to Lazada. And I'm wondering how the situation goes. How the situation goes at this moment, especially recently, Unfinance was further crushed down by Chinese government of IPO things, right? Is that further negatively impacted?
Okay, so our question has to do with the big difference between unbanked people and the people who are in the e-payment world. And one of the kind of intentional, moves into this sector was Lazada, and in partnership with Alipay.
Yep.
And now, evidently, there may be quite a bit of reaction against this, joint thing with China. What's the situation with that like at present? And what kind of prospects do you see for this kind of international cooperation?
I think internationally and financial has made really good strides over the last couple of years, in a sense that, like in Malaysia, and invested in Touch and Go, which is probably the biggest and most successful e-wallet in Malaysia. So if they were operating in Malaysia as Ant Financials, I think there was probably a couple more setbacks. But because they invested through a Malaysian subsidiary, or not Malaysian subsidiary, but Malaysian startup, they were a bit more successful in doing the execution. I'd say this part of the world, the foreign players are still pretty strong. Lazada, Shopee, they're still strong players here, even Tencent, but Tencent not so much in Malaysia, but somewhere like Thailand. They're pretty strong still. I'd say the foreign players are here to stay, and we'll probably see more foreign guys coming in to invest in this part of the world. We've seen that in the last couple of years or so, but with borders opening up, we've seen an influx of guys again.
Specific to China investment in kind of startup companies in Southeast Asia, does it seem to be on the decline, or does it seem to be on the rise?
China's probably muted. We've seen a lot of North Asian, so Korea, Japan, but China's been muted in the last 2 years or so. It's a bit hard to invest if you can come out. So
Do
you
you
can do it
think
very
that's
early.
concern, is that because of concern about eventually going into the US and having to deal with American CFIUS regulations, or what's kind of going on?
Not so much that. I think it's more they're only allowed to come out, and I think that's really it. It's really as simple as that. You know, the Chinese haven't been able to come out, right? When you go back, it's a 3 week quarantine. I think now it's a bit short to a week. But you know, if you're 3 weeks quarantine, it's gonna come out. So that's mostly that.
Okay. Are you seeing a lot of impact investing where you are?
There's more talks about it. I wouldn't say there's a lot more investing in it. So I think the short answer is people care about it a little bit more, but I wouldn't say we're investing in it a lot more. Again, I think the difference with Southeast Asia versus the US is it's pretty early on in terms of investing in anything.
Yeah.
So I think while people talk about it, and for us, we talk about it and we kind of invest in that. But would I put a line there to quantitatively measure that? I'm not 100% sure we're there yet. And so it's more it's a nice to have versus I need to do this.
So I'm curious if you would comment on the role of Singapore in the region. So, in Singapore has an incredibly high per person GDP and high income level.
Yep.
Higher than the United States.
Yep.
And so I'm curious, for the rest of Southeast Asia, what does Singapore mean?
Singapore means capital. Singapore means access to capital, right? So it's Singapore, it's Monaco, it's New York, it's Hong Kong. With the closing of Hong Kong, I say closing in a very bad way. With the closure of Hong Kong in terms of its accessibility, Singapore has emerged as a different funding base or alternate funding base in Asia. And so if you look at a lot of the family offices or institutions globally, they've set up business or firms in Singapore. So I say that there's more access to capital in Singapore versus anywhere else in the world. Even currently, I'd say globally, most guys are there already. If not,
Okay. What about on the technology side? Because you've got a lot of advanced research going on in Singapore. Yep. Are you seeing kind of deep tech stuff starting to come into the area? Is it especially connected to Singapore, or is it really more general?
So I'd say probably, I think deep tech is something we don't focus on a lot. There's more research that's being done in terms of bio, healthcare, deep tech. But something that we focus on a lot is food tech. We think this part of the world, speaking to your ESG question, is about sustainability. So we've invested in food in a big way. So either alternative protein or food supply chain issues, or just simply kind of thinking about agriculture and making it smarter in terms of e-farming, co-farming kind of thing. And so Singapore has led the markets in terms of investing in food because they've basically realized that, they need to be self-sustainable when COVID hits. And so they've invested in quite a bit of food manufacturing and technology from that standpoint. And so it's something that we actively participate. Again, I think because it's a relatively poor region, when I say Southeast Asia as a whole for Southeast Asia, the nutrients that people are getting are not the right nutrients in a sense that, people are focusing more on carbs versus vitamins. And so when you do that, there's a lot of obesity issues. So I don't know whether this is real, but the stats apparently is 60% of Malaysia is obese, which is a huge stat. And so, when we're investing, we're thinking about things of how to solve that part of it. And again, there's trickle down effects about healthcare. And so we want it to be, a forethought as opposed to an afterthought, in the sense that we're investing in getting people healthier and fitter, as opposed to investing in, hospital chains much later down the road. And so trying to make sure that people get the right nutrition, again, education, and then during COVID, for example, the supply chain was broken, and there was quite a bit of food wastage in terms of getting from the farms to the consumers. And then so instead of us wasting those food, we're want either to be able to donate it or getting cheaper access or giving consumers cheaper access to food that the F&B or the HoReCas would typically get. So again, we're trying to be innovative in the ways that we deliver healthy nutrients to people, and not just the expensive stuff as alternative protein. So we invested in, for example, Well, which is an alternative protein, and using chickpeas from Israel. We say we will substitute a lot of the meat or the protein solution. We don't say we're substituting meat as a whole, but we say, hey, we're going to be an alternative protein for a lot of the people in the world, and getting cheap access to that kind of protein, right? Instead of Beyond Meats, for example, is unaffordable for this part of the world. So we say, how do we get cheaper affordability to people here?
Yeah, okay. We've got a couple of questions from the room. Before I get to them, though, that last point about alternative protein, is there anything particular regional about that, or is this just something that's going to be competing against Beyond Meat and Impossible Burger next month?
Well, I think it depends, right? Pricing is probably a big deal.
Okay.
So for Beyond, the patties here are 200 ringgit for a pack of patties. To give you perspective, to get a bowl of noodles is 5 ringgit.
5 as opposed to 200. Okay, right. Okay.
So that's
okay. Dale, why don't you ask your question? You were first.
Hi, Rachel. I wanted to ask about blockchain in Malaysia and in Southeast Asia. During the first internet boom, there was a rush to market with a bunch of products, with the mentality being that the first to market would, in any particular area, would consolidate the market and become the monopoly in that particular area. But ultimately, we saw a lot of stratification and geographic specialization, and it split into a bunch of different geographic regions. But also, we're seeing the same motions in blockchain and Web3 today, where there's a first-to-market type of mentality to try and dominate the rest. But ultimately, I do think that there is still going to be a lot of geographic regionalism and other diversifications in blockchain. I just wanted to ask if you have heard of any specific protocols that are serving Malaysia or Southeast Asia well, especially with payments to the unbanked and stuff like that, or stuff that you see a lot of potential in.
Okay. First of all, did you hear that?
I heard most of it, so I can answer.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So first to market being something that traditionally is, a big factor in success.
Mm-hmm.
Is blockchain still in that kind of a stage? And what about reaching out to the unbanked? Other kind of solutions for them? Okay.
I'll take that question in a slightly different way. So Uber was first to market in Southeast Asia in terms of transportations. Not anyone else. It was really Uber. And then Grab came up, right? And everyone said, why do you need Grab when there's Uber already? And again, touching on the cultural significance, what Uber did was everyone needs to put in a credit card. But when most of the population was unbanked, there was no credit cards, right? And so Grab came up, and again, this was also, touching on what China DDs did was they allowed cash payments, and again, it was COD. So you ended a ride and you kind of paid the guy cash. Uber was too arrogant to say, we're going to do that because we don't do that for the rest of the world. And so it was really, as simple as that. People couldn't take Uber because they didn't have a credit card, and they won't be able to put a credit card into the system. And then it kind of, this was maybe 5 to 6 years ago. So it was relatively new, by the way. And they were first to market. And obviously there was Grab, and there was a lot of guys that were around. There was consolidation played by Grab at the end. Again, I think largely brokered by SoftBank more than anyone else. And then we kind of saw that kind of settle down. Currently on the payment space, we see huge competition. I don't think there's a winner yet in terms of who's going to come out as the biggest winner. So I don't think the first to market has a significant advantage in a sense that the place is pretty chaotic, right? And so there's no leading app in a sense that, you know, if you go on Grab, you're going to be the winner. Because again, you know, I'll use Grab as an example. You know, I use it for ride hailing, and I use it for an e-wallet. There's probably another 50 functions I don't use, and I don't plan to use. And so from that standpoint, you know, and that's me. And then how do you get the people who unbank on that system? I'm not 100% sure. So in Indonesia, I think they've done it a little better in a sense that if you go on a Gojek app, you're able to put, and I think some of these it was not very successful, but they did try in a sense that, you know, you could put your money using Gojek as a bank account, and then therefore using it as an e-wallet. The issue that therefore was, how do you do KYCs and how do you do, you know, anti-laundering measures, which, you know, they got into trouble, right? And so there were things that, you know, it was a nice to have, but the infrastructure was not there to support that innovation at that point. So while I think we're still going to try, I'm not sure if there's a perfect solution to it just yet. There's been a couple of digital banking licenses that's been awarded in this part of the world. I asked everybody the same thing. I don't see a need for digital banking, and they said, why not? And I said, you know, a couple of years ago, there was ING Direct, there was all these internet banking companies, and what's the big deal versus now? I haven't had a good answer in terms of what innovation they're trying to do besides, you know, getting, you know, the unbanked into the banking system. But I think if it was that easy, the banking system would have already tried. There are other issues, right? You know, I think the way that we look at the unbanked has to be totally different from what the banking system wants. And if you go through a banking regulation standpoint, it will probably be the same regulations that they enforce on the e-banking system. So I'm not 100% sure. Like I said, the guidelines aren't out yet. They've awarded a couple of, like, I think Philippines and Singapore has awarded licenses out. But in terms of how they're going to do it, I don't think anybody has a good solution yet.
Okay, great. You have a question.
Yes, yeah. You mentioned how investing and startups and venture is still relatively in the early stages in Malaysia. And I'm curious kind of what your vision is in terms of just what kind of concrete developments would you like to see in the next 5, 10, or however many years in terms of developing that sector?
Okay, so the question is about, it's still being kind of early for the whole entrepreneurship support system and investing system. What would you like to see in Malaysia over the next 5 years to really help this system become more robust?
Yep. There's a couple of things, right? You know, when we first started, lawyers didn't understand what was going on. There was no fund accountants here. And so I think with more funds being set up in Malaysia or Southeast Asia, there is an ecosystem that is able to help the startups. And it's got to be not just the startups or parties or events or people splashing money around, right? It's got to be, you know, a whole ecosystem of lawyers, fund accountants, investors, you know, guys like Richard kind of, you know, delivering the message across the world, people understanding what is needed here. And so we've kind of said that, you know, we're going to invest more in this part of the world. One, because we understand it, and we've done this a little bit longer than the others. But two, also there's a huge opportunity here, which we do see that people are starting to understand this. Again, the China-US relationship souring is probably the biggest focal point right now because of China-US fighting. Most of the people realized they needed to diversify supply chain and manufacturing and sales channels. And so we've kind of benefited from the war from that standpoint. And it really is a true thing. So in terms of capital, in terms of skills and know-how, I think it really has that, has done that. But again, I think COVID also has changed the landscape quite a bit, in the sense that, someone like Hong Kong and China has decided to be, domestically driven, and they've decided to not be part of globalization. Well, Southeast Asia say, hey, when we're opening up, so please come, please invest in us. And so I think once you're able to do that, I think there's a lot more opportunities here.
Yeah, the news this week, one of the items is that Foxconn is building a factory in southern India in order to build iPhones.
Yes.
So, this is definitely something that has benefited other parts of the region outside China. What do you see as the biggest kind of barrier to cross-border investment in the Southeast Asia region?
One is culture, and obviously two is the understanding of culture here, right? In Singapore, it's easy. So you get there, I'd say there's probably like 40% foreigners versus 70% locals at this point. Again, don't quote me on a lot of these stats because I'm kind of just guessing some of it. But it's a pretty easy place to be in. In somewhere like Indonesia, it's the same in a sense that they're a bit more accepting towards people coming in. They're giving out visas a little bit more freely to entrepreneurs coming in, and therefore you're also being able to bring more skilled labor. Somewhere like Malaysia is a bit more closely looped in a sense that we're not that receptive towards foreign talent. One is very protectionism, so it's more than anything else. Not that we don't like foreigners, but we've got to make sure that there's the good jobs are kept by the locals. And so once you do that, So once you look into that a little bit more, I think there's more things to do here.
Okay, so we're about out of time for the formal part of the session. What I'd like to ask you to kind of end with is recommendations to young people here who have an interest in the growth of entrepreneurship, the growth of startup businesses, the growth of markets in Southeast Asia. What should they do? What's the first thing that they should focus on, and what kind of recommendations would you give?
Well, if you're interested, there's a couple of good publications that publishing Southeast Asian news. Tech in Asia is pretty decent. Deal Street Asia is also pretty decent.
Tech in Asia, right? It's an online newsletter. Yeah.
Yeah, and same as Deal Street Asia. They got bought over by the Financial Times. They're pretty good in terms of getting local news. Otherwise, to be fair, there's quite a bit of events these days on promoting Southeast Asia, whether it's Malaysia and Asia. I think the governments have done a good job in terms of promotion. I think, that's we probably stop there in terms of anything else.
So that's good. Thank you very much for putting up with just straight talking. I appreciate that so much, Rachel. Great content today. Everybody, thank you. Please joining me in thanking Rachel for a great presentation.
Thank you.
Really informative.